Welcome to the podcast. I'm Gary Dumbrell, and today we're going to be talking about the experience of refugees, specifically refugees who have been engaged with child protection services. I got interested in this topic a number of years ago when in Hamilton, Ontario, refugees were protesting outside the local Children's Aid Society. Children's Aid Societies in Ontario have a child protection mandate, so they're the child protection agencies of the province. Refugees were saying that their children were being taken away by these agencies in disproportionate numbers, and that these agencies were engaging with them in ways that didn't really work for them or their communities. I thought this was a bit of a puzzle, because if anyone knows how to keep children safe, it's got to be refugees. After all, refugees have escaped war zones, sometimes crossed oceans, sometimes walked across entire continents, and yet they've arrived at what they thought was a place of safety and a place of refuge with their children. So to have navigated all of that, refugees must know something about protecting children. This idea that refugees know a great deal about protecting children was borne out later in the research I did with them. This notion was also borne out when I was in Berlin in 2015, welcoming some Syrian refugees along with Berliners there. It was pretty amazing seeing how many children there were that had managed to make this perilous journey with their parents. I'm going to go off on a tangent for a minute because when I was in Berlin, I went to the Holocaust Museum and saw a photograph and took a photograph of this photograph. And it was Jewish refugees escaping Germany in World War II to escape the Holocaust. They were on a ship and they were in a circle dancing with their arms around each other, and there was someone in the middle dancing. A couple of days later, when I was at this event welcoming Syrian refugees, they were doing the exact same dance, putting their arms around each other, dancing in a circle with someone in the middle of the circle, and then switching it up so that somebody else danced in the middle of the circle too. Same dance, different people, different moment in history. And there was something about the juxtaposition of those two moments in the photographs I took that was really compelling. And I still keep thinking about it. There's a deeper message in those images than I'm able to grasp at the moment. So if any of you have got ideas about that, leave me comments about what do you think the meaning of that was. But anyway, back to the topic. Wanting to look at what was going on in Hamilton and also in a bigger context globally, because this was a glimpse of something that was going on around the world where refugees were coming into conflict with child protection services. So with a research project like this, there's all kinds of ways you could approach it. One way is to go to the agency and talk to workers. One way is to do file reviews and look at the protection grounds that people went out on and looking at eligibility spectrums and all kinds of research from the agency perspective about why they felt the need to get involved with these families. That's not usually how I do most of my research. I do it from the other end, from the receiving end of services. What I'm usually interested in, people on the receiving end, what have they got to say about this? How do they make sense of what is going on? So in my research, I look at what I call service users knowledge and service users theory. So service users knowledge is the lived experience service users have of their own troubles and the services that are provided to try and alleviate or address those troubles. Service users theory is the development of that knowledge, that collective knowledge among service users by service users themselves into theory that explains the origins of these troubles. And some of that has implications for the way services need to be developed. So it's developing ideas about improving the services from the receiving end. So with that in mind, I started meeting with refugees and talking with them about their understanding of what was going on with Children's Aid Societies. We also discussed what they thought would be helpful. What kind of research was needed to change things for the better for them and their communities. So what we eventually came up with is something called a PhotoVoice project. And a PhotoVoice project uses stories and photographs to communicate messages. And the refugees wanted the opportunity to develop messages that they could have delivered and deliver themselves to service providers and workers in the hope that these messages were going to be things that changed services for the better. So the project was about developing these messages through this community-based research project that refugees thought would shift the way services was delivered for the better. So why PhotoVoice? Why is PhotoVoice useful for a project like this? Well, the first reason is it gives participants voice. It gives them a way to speak and to consolidate their knowledge into something that can be shared and disseminated. The next thing the method does is it allows participants to design the research. We'd already been doing that before this particular method was chosen, so the PhotoVoice method built naturally on what we'd started doing already. So in this method, the participants go out and take photographs, tell their stories, and make their own points from the data. In this whole process, participants co-own the findings and they're free to disseminate it themselves. And we consolidated the findings into a number of posters. So a number of the participants took the posters and presented them at different community events and venues. As well, participants were also encouraged to write from the research themselves and to take those ideas further. One of the things I commit to do is to support any one of the participants who want to engage in that process. Well, one such person who did that was Isaac Yoyo. He got an opportunity to present independently on his own at a conference, and he developed this in his own refereed article called How Can We Bell the Cat? African Perspectives on Canadian Child Welfare Systems. And if you search for that, How Do We Bell the Cat? African Canadian Perspectives on Canadian Child Welfare Systems, and type in the word Isaac Yoyo, ISAAC YOR, that will come up on the internet. It's open source, and you can hear how he developed some of the ideas that emerged out of this research and took them even further, which is the idea about this research, that the community owns it and they take it in places that they want to take it. For me, this is the ideal behind research. It's not something that's done and owned by the ivory tower and locked up behind a paywall. It's something that's done in the community and belongs to the community. After all, it's their knowledge, and in social work, it's their lives. In a future podcast, I'll probably meet with Isaac and we can talk together about how those ideas have been developed and where he's taking them and where he thinks they need to go now. So with those ideas in mind, we need to get into the nitty-gritty of the research. So we meet as a group and we ask what kind of knowledge is really needed here? How do we develop that knowledge? So then we design the method and participants go out, gather the data, analyze and develop the key messages. So PhotoVoice obviously involves photographs. What refugees wanted to do was to talk with their families and catalog their experiences, but catalog experiences that they believe were related to either child welfare systems or to issues that led them to become involved with child protection services, and to ultimately help child protection services to better engage and support their families and children. Interestingly, they didn't want to shut child protection services down. They didn't want them to go away and never come back again, although that did emerge in some of the interviews. Collectively, what they decided was the best thing is that if the services could change in a way that could become more beneficial to their community. So then the idea was to go out with cameras, to meet with family members, to discuss ideas that emerge for refugees in their life in Canada that is somehow connected to social work, social services, and child protection. And to bring those themes together, to figure out what's going on in those processes, and to unravel it in a way that develops messages that they believe are essential for service providers and policymakers to understand if they're going to engage with their communities in a way that makes sense and is useful to those communities and the children in those communities. The camera part comes in so that they can tell those stories and develop those themes in photographs and also in words. We bring the photographs back, we spread them over a table, we talk about the themes that have developed, and at this point there are literally dozens and dozens of themes and threads and stories. And then as a group of refugees narrow these down into like core categories, core key messages that they want to give to service providers. And by a core category, I mean like a heading, a concept that pulls together the threads of many stories and ideas. And 4 of those emerged. The first one was understand our hopes and fears. They thought this was essential for social workers and policymakers to understand the hopes and fears that refugees come with. They thought it was also essential for social workers to understand the settlement challenges that refugees face. They also thought it was essential that social workers deal with racism. Racism impacted the daily lives of refugees all the time. And without understanding how this was working, social workers wouldn't really grasp what these families were dealing with. And then the last theme was to work with refugees in the development of services. Refugees wanted to develop child protection services, child welfare services, and other services, and to have a say in how they're delivered. So those are the 4 themes. And I'll take us through each of those themes individually. So the first theme is understand our hopes and fears. A lot of time was spent talking about the escape from war zones, and often the considerable time spent in refugee camps waiting to come to somewhere safe. I remember one refugee mother telling me how she had been in a house and some troops came and they launched a rocket at the house and blew it up, and everyone was killed inside except for her. And she then spent 15 years in a refugee camp before she managed to come to Canada. I thought, naively, that refugees would be glad for themselves that they had managed to escape. But what emerged from the research consistently across all of the parents was that they escaped for their children. One quote that really summed that up is, "I have a long story, but I will make it shorter. We came here for our daughters." And alongside this, they took a picture of one of the small children holding a Canadian flag. So the dream within that flag was not so much for themselves, it was the future of their children. Another mum took a picture of some bushes and woods in a trail in Hamilton. And she said that I took this picture of the bushes because when you're in the middle of the forest, you can't see your way out. And it's so hard to try and see where to go. This is what it was like for those of us who came from a refugee camp. Sometimes you stay there for years and you wait and nothing happens. You get frustrated, you want to go back home, but you can't go back home because of the war. So those of us who are refugees and immigrants can attest how far it was for us to get to Canada. And within this, how far it was to get to Canada, was the story of their children, because that is why they came here. Another mother took a photograph of a new highway being built, and it's a picture of a highway that's completely clear and it goes off to the horizon. She said, "It wasn't easy bringing our kids here. This photo is a road. It shows how far we've come for a better future for our kids. My kids will go to school in Canada and become somebody who has a future. You know, our expectations of coming here are great. But sometimes it can go the other way, where you can't discipline your child because the Children's Aid Society will come after you and the government will take our kids from us." Now, I've worked in Children's Aid Society many years ago, and we never used to take children away just because they were disciplined. There always had to be some risk to the children. So I had these conversations with participants, and I began to see it from their perspective. Discipline looks a little bit different when you're a refugee. Parents told me that when you're in a refugee camp, your children have to do exactly what you say when you say it. Otherwise, they're at extreme risk. How the refugees I spoke to kept their children alive was pretty strict discipline, asking them to do exactly what they were told. There were a lot of people running around with guns, and unless kids did what their parents told them when they told them, it was particularly dangerous. Now, we think that Canada is different to that. Well, maybe not. One of the focus groups in the evening, a whole family was late, and when they came in, they said what had happened is that the apartment next to theirs, the police SWAT team kicked the front door in and raided it. So there were police outside telling everybody to keep down. They had automatic weapons. These photographs of the police weren't taken by participants. They were taken by me a couple of years later when the police asked me to do some photography for them. But they show the kind of thing that goes on when a tactical response unit is called in. This is not dissimilar to some of the settings refugees came from. Some of the things that the refugees spoke of seeing going on in their neighborhoods and in their streets were dangerous. and they were concerned about their children's safety. It really is essential to see this process from the refugees' perspective. Another refugee mother said that my children are growing up and are learning ways of a different society, and I see my children have grown up to have no respect. We feel our children are out of our hands. When we get here, we become frustrated that our way of doing things back home can't be implemented on this side of the world because it's all so different. We can't bring our children up our way. Another parent then interjected, yes, a 10-year-old would act like a 4-year-old. If you tell them not to do something, they'll always do it. Back home, if you have a 10-year-old, most of the time they'll act like adults because they're disciplined to know the difference between right and wrong. The whole vision we have about our children coming to Canada is shattered because the society we found ourselves in is a very different one. In the settings where refugees come from, if their children had been acting like they act here, it would be a sign of extreme danger for those children. And that's where their wisdom about how to keep children safe begins to kick in. And it's essential for Child Protection Services to understand that when engaging with these parents. To emphasize that point, another mother took a photograph, and it's a billboard sign, and underneath the billboard sign in the distance you can see a small black shape. And she says, you can't really see it in this picture, but this is a squirrel that got injured by a car crossing the road. The squirrel would have survived, maybe, if it were not for a gang of youths who chased it and kicked it to death. I know it was only a squirrel, but when I saw it, I thought of my children, and I realized that Canada can be a dangerous place. Canada is a dangerous place, and a scary place, if you're new here and you see things like this going on. Not to labor this point too much, but this was a core theme that refugees wanted service providers and policymakers to understand our hopes and fears. This is where we come from, and when we engage with our children, these are the hopes we have for them, these are the fears we have for them. The next theme is understand our settlement challenges. One of the mums took a picture of a group of businessmen walking down the street in Hamilton, and she said, my husband was like these businessmen. He was a civil engineer. He went to university and had lots of work experience, but here he is a technician. We were middle class in our country, but we became the lowest class here. It affects our family, the kids, your emotions, your behavior. When I see white collars like these ones in the picture, I feel really sorry, really disappointed for my husband. And this mum talked about the impact this process had on her life in Canada and thought this was also important for social workers to understand. There was another mother who told a story and didn't have a picture for it. So we decided in the focus group that we would take a picture of her with her face in her hands in despair because this incident caused her to feel that. At that particular time, the mum was living on benefits and something had gone wrong with the check. It hadn't arrived and it should have arrived. It was a mistake by social workers that caused this. So she went to the office and she doesn't speak English, so her children had to interpret for her. I should also note as an aside that in our focus group, we didn't have children interpret. We had interpreters there quite independently doing that for us. So this mum shows up and she talks about her need for this check to be there. And the social worker she met started to give her a lecture, interpreted through the children. The worker said to her that really what you need to do is to manage your money better. So telling through her young children, you have to manage your money better. The ways to do that are to go to the food bank, collect food when you can't afford to buy food, and go to the thrift store. Buy your children's clothes at the thrift store. And as I said, we took a photograph of the mother in despair with her face in her hands. And she said that already she'd been getting food at the food bank and she'd been buying her children clothes at the thrift store, but had never told her children that because she didn't want them to be aware of it. And now she was getting a lecture from a social worker telling her to go do those things, and the children were the interpreters. There was a lot of upset in the group about that story. And they asked me, why don't social workers have a heart? And I said, social workers do have a heart, but they weren't entirely sure that was true. So I made a commitment that whenever I speak about this, I say to social workers that you need to have a heart. The most important thing, I think, that you take to the client is yourself as a human being and treating them as a human being. That's where good help begins. Of course you need to do more than that. But if you can't even do that, really you should be doing a different job. That also goes for policymakers. If you can't visualize that the people on the receiving end of this policy are humans and they need to be treated as such, it's not the work for you. The next theme is deal with racism. There were many stories about how racism impacted refugees in Canada. One dad said that undercover racism in Canada is far beyond limit. A mum interjected, I wanted to wear a poppy for Remembrance Day, but I was afraid to do so because a white lady came up to my friend from Pakistan and told her, take that poppy off. It's only for Canadians to wear. There was another story that we had to take a photograph in the group to communicate what occurred. And the way we did this was to have 3 of the participants in the focus group who didn't mind being in a photograph to be photographed looking at a poster. And on the poster we wrote, welcome to Canada, go back home. So the story of this photograph is that it was something on a t-shirt. The participants explained, we made this poster and took a photo of it to show you. This is the sign that a man in my school in Hamilton, this is an adult education evening class, was wearing. So this guy came into the class wearing a t-shirt, and the class was made up mostly of refugees, and the t-shirt said, welcome to Canada, go back home. There were a lot of immigrants and refugees in that class. Now, the instructor in the class told that person to go back home and don't come back until you change that t-shirt. So good for the instructor. But of course, the damage had already been done. The person wearing the t-shirt left, but left the damage and harm behind him. And we have to remember that that incident builds on the poppy incident and this next story that I'm going to tell you. We took a photograph of a well-known coffee shop because that's where this story happened. And a mum explains, my daughter won an iPod from a well-known coffee shop, but they didn't give it to her. We went 3 times, my husband went 2, but they say sorry, and we're still waiting for that iPod. I wondered if they, the coffee shop workers, took advantage of the language barrier. They know you won't report or complain what happened to that iPod. Now, incidentally, one of the research team went to the coffee shop with that mum and got the iPod. So we don't know whether that was a misunderstanding, but in the context of the other 2 stories and daily stories of racism impacting the lives of refugees, you have to wonder. And I think having to wonder and not being sure some of the time is one of the issues refugees face. The last theme is work with us to develop service. So here, refugees are asking to be involved in the policy-making process and also in the process of training social workers as well. So a father explains, social workers tell our children that they have the right to leave home at 16. What kind of a future can a child expect if they leave home at 16? This story actually referenced a school social worker who was telling a refugee child that if they were having trouble with their parents when they're 16, hey, you can leave home. To say this to our children, social workers must either not care about them or have very low expectations for their future. We have higher hopes for our children. Do social workers say this to their own children? So in the focus group, participants were trying to imagine what kind of a life a child would have if they left home at 16. That there should be a different way of processing this with a young person other than saying, hey, you can just leave home, even if that is true. This, by the way, was before child welfare legislation changed the age of protection from 16 to 18, which will come up in a minute again in another one of the points refugees were making. The refugees in the focus group also told another story that was really tragic. A child from our community was taken by Children's Aid. Soon after, she, with the other children in government care, stole a car. They crashed the car and she died. I don't know the story of this particular young person other than this outcome, and I don't know what led to her coming into care. Children's Aid societies don't usually take teenagers away unless there's conflict. And I do wonder if that conflict came from the parents' attempt to keep that young person safe. But the solution to that conflict, the solution was for them to go into care, to go into a group home, and it met with this tragic end. And this story was going around the entire refugee communities. And a mother interjected when she heard this story. Considering where I came from and what I had to do to take care of my child, to come to a land where you think everything will be okay, and then to have a child die when they're healthy and they're not sick, that is sad. But we can't do anything to stop this because we came here and we don't know our way around, so who would advise us? So these parents are looking for advice, but they're not sure who will be able to give that advice to them. Certainly at this point, they're not sure whether they can trust social workers or not. So the point of this story is not to demonize Children's Aid societies or even to say that they did the wrong thing in this case. That's an oversimplistic conclusion. The point of this story, and the point that participants were making, is that policymakers, social workers, and the refugee communities need to work together on these issues. They wanted to be involved in working with social workers and policymakers to develop policies and services that made sense to refugee communities. They wanted a voice in that process. Continuing this theme, participants took some photographs that surprised me. It was of homeless people on the street, and this had a particular significance for them that I would not have seen coming. They took a picture of a homeless man sitting on a bench, and they said, back home, you wouldn't think that there would be homeless people in Canada. When we see them, homeless people that is, we wonder why. Canada is supposed to have all the opportunities. Canada's what we want for our home. Yet there are people that are homeless here. Why are they homeless? Was it their upbringing that caused these problems? So when refugees see homeless people on the streets, they see danger. Not in the homeless person as a person. They had a lot of compassion for homeless people. But in the fact that they are homeless. How do you wind up homeless in such a wealthy country, in a country where education is free? They immediately saw this as a danger that might befall their children. And they began to think that it was something perhaps in the upbringing of these people that caused this kind of problem. Maybe not, but this is what their worry was. So if there is something you can do when you raise children in the Canadian context that is going to result in this problem, what is it? Because they need to make sure they're not doing that they're avoiding their children falling into this trap, whatever it is. They took another picture on a school day of a number of young people hanging out in the town square. And they said, these children hanging around the town square, some of these kids are in the care of the Children's Aid societies. They take your kids, they say that they're the best, that their way of raising children is better than ours. Then why are these kids hanging out on the street? Maybe the CAS should ask why these children are out on the street. Is it because of a lack of discipline or guidance? Will some of these children grow up to be homeless? What does the future hold for them? Now, the participants didn't really know that these were young people in CAS care hanging out on the street. They could have been any kids. Although when I did present these pictures, even though the faces were blotted out, to the Children's Aid societies in the area, they said probably some of these kids are their kids. So again, this connection between homelessness in Canada and raising children was playing on the minds of participants. And the final photograph in the series was an elderly homeless man walking down a path, and at the end of the path was a police SUV with police officers looking at him walking. And a mum said, I took this picture because I saw on the news last week that some homeless people who were living in a Toronto neighbourhood were moved on by the police. The people in that neighbourhood wanted them driven away. Some of these homeless people once were the same kids that the Children's Aid took and let go at 18. They've grown up and they're homeless, and now the same government that took them from their homes drives them away. But where do they go? So what is the Children's Aid for? Maybe they should revisit their plan. Now, of course, we can get into a debate about children who do remarkably well in Children's Aid Society. We can look at data about who becomes homeless and who doesn't. But this is what is in the mind of refugee parents, and this is their worry. They're also asking a deeper question here. And it's really important to grasp that deeper question. At the time this was raised, the child protection mandate went up to 16 years of age. So in the discussions with participants, they were trying to understand how, in Canada, when a young person is in trouble, up until 16, they send the Children's Aid Society out to help them and, if necessary, to bring them into care, into a safe place. But once they're over that age, Canada sends the police out to move them on, out of the neighbourhood. And to them, this seemed bizarre. Because when you're under 16 and when you're over 16, you're exactly the same human being. So why have this boundary, which is now 18? So let's take it to 18. So when you're under 18 and when you're over 18, you're the same human being with the same needs, the same hopes, the same worries. So why in one moment do you send a social worker out to bring them in and care for them, and in the next moment, the next day when they've turned 18, you send the police out to move them along? And the question they raised was, do we really care about children here as people, or is it childhood as a concept? Because that concept ends when they reach 18, and then we don't seem to care about them anymore. Certainly not as a human being, we don't, because we move them out of our neighbourhood with the police. So getting their heads around this was pretty difficult. And I've got to admit, it's pretty difficult to get my head around it too. Doesn't make sense. And they've actually convinced me that when we do child welfare in Canada, it's actually the concept of child welfare that matters more to us than the people who fall within that category of person. Because once you're over 18, you're still the same human being. So those were the 4 themes. Understand our hopes and fears, understand our settlement challenges, deal with racism, work with us in the development of services. So I've shared this many times. Refugees have shared this many times. Isaac, who I mentioned before, has written on this and taken these ideas further. We're still trying to get that last one on the agenda. Like in classes, we can explain and convey what refugees themselves have said about their hopes and fears. We can do a lot of work on what the settlement challenges are. And in all social work courses across Canada, we're trying to deal with racism. We educate people how racism works in its many forms. And we educate them about how white supremacy works. That last one, work with us in the development of services. It's not until we invite service users to come in and train workers in agencies to work with policy makers and to help deliver social work education in universities that we're going to get to grips with these issues. There seems to be a lot of resistance to that. Work with us in the development of services. We need to be working with refugees. We need to be working with other service users in the development of services, the development of policy, the training of workers in the field, and the training of social workers in social work school. That's got to be the way forward. And I think that the messages from this research project have really demonstrated that. And also the way service users themselves took up these ideas, disseminated them, written articles about them themselves, show that that is entirely possible. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Stay safe out there.